Hello and welcome. I'm David Wallace and welcome to Justice Speaks. I am a Chief Assistant Prosecutor in Michigan, and I'm also the president of the Justice Speakers Institute, or co-president. And I'm co-president with Judge Brian McKenzie. And we are excited and proud to have now join us as a team member on Justice Speakers Institute, Chief Cynthia Herriott, who is now our Vice President of Law Enforcement. And she joins myself and Judge McKenzie and Chief Mac Jenkins, the Vice President of Community Supervision. And we're just thrilled to have you join us, Cynthia. And we thought we'd take some time here in this episode and talk a little bit about you and who you are and how Justice Speakers Institute is really going forward with this now. So welcome to Justice Speaks.
Thank you, David. I'm excited to be here. I really am.
And I introduced you. I said, in fact, Chief Cynthia Herriott. You were at one point in time the Chief of Police for Rochester Police Department. But why don't you tell us a little more about your background and who is Cynthia Herriott?
Sure, of course. I've spent most of my life in Rochester, New York, where I served as police chief. But I've spent a bit of time in the criminal justice field overall. And so I came up through the police academy. I think I joined in the late 80s. And not trying to date myself.
Okay, I'm before that for prosecutors, so.
Okay. Yeah, so I spent a bit of time with that. Loved it, learned a lot. And that's actually how I got involved in drug court process. Is one of the judges in Rochester, Judge Valentino, and also Judge Schwartz, he had talked to me about getting involved in that process and teaching teams because I'd done a lot of work around community intervention. It's work I loved. But I also learned something about myself, that I care about getting at the causations. I was very dissatisfied to come in as law enforcement and arrest people when I knew it didn't solve the problem.
Sure.
Yeah, it really was something I just was not satisfied with. So I've always been pretty involved in the community, very involved in my church. My family and I grew up being very close. And even when I went back to school, got my master's degree, that was around the area of policing, law enforcement, and leadership. And so my thesis involved ethical leadership and how does one ensure that there's ethical leadership in police departments.
Oh.
It was really interesting, not just to do the work, but it was something I was passionate about. So I was very happy to be able to do that. But I found that, as is the case with a hypothesis, I found that it's not enough to put ethical people there. You have to take care of the environment.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, you got to get it ready for them. And then put ethical leaders in, and that gives you your highest chance of success. So I spent a little bit of time in law enforcement, left and worked for the National Drug Court Institute in DC.
That's where we met at.
Yes. We were colleagues for a little while. Loved it. Didn't like the traffic, but
no.
Yeah, but loved the work. That was a really great experience. I wouldn't change it for anything. And then I moved on to other professional roles. I'm very fortunate in that it was not something I really had to worry about.
Sure.
I was fortunate to be able to move on to other opportunities. And I learned something, though, when I work with my career coach. Is she said, I tend to seek truth-telling roles.
Okay.
Yeah. But it was a good way to understand what drives me, and so that as I looked for other opportunities to go to places that I felt, I would be a good fit for. And so that was something I tried to do throughout my career after that. And ended up uh, having a conversation with the mayor of the city of Rochester. She called me and asked me to come back and serve in the role as police chief. And I don't know, there was something in her voice that really got through to me. And she just said, I need you to do this. But I'll tell you something, David. Rochester, at the time, it was going through some
Right.
difficulties. And I believe we were in a bit of a crisis. And I got why. Not that I'm so great and someone else couldn't come in, but I'm someone that is big on transparency and being very open with the community. And I feel like those relationships are critical.
Yep.
And once I was there for a little bit, I understood you really needed that at the time. If Rochester had one more incident of an officer-involved shooting and the circumstances were questionable, I think things would have been really, really tough at that point. So even though it was a very busy time for me, I don't miss the calls at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m.
I don't blame you on that.
Yeah, but I don't regret it though.
Yeah.
Judge, who's a good friend of mine, a Supreme Court judge, I had called him when the opportunity came up, and I asked him about it, what he thought I should do, and he said, "Cynthia, I would equate this to being the country's at war, and you're being drafted." He said,
Wow.
"Yeah, they need you, and I can't think of anybody with your skill set that's probably a better match." And
High praise.
yeah, I would always think about that though, but I get it now. Yeah, I said no several times, but I get it now though. And so,
and you only did it you were only there for what's called, I'll say temporary, in the sense of, but it was a long temporary. I mean, it was over a year, as I recall.
yeah.
But they brought you in to make some changes, and
yeah.
From what I hear, you made a number of changes and at least got things started.
You know what we did, some of around the critical areas that we were having some issues with. So, for example, one of the changes was a new policy on use of force against juveniles, and that specified, when you could and you couldn't, and if the person may have initially been combative, then they calmed down, then that,
right.
Then it was over. So things like that were really needed to get us to a certain point and past some of the issues that we were having. But yeah,
as you say, good learning experience, and you don't regret it. It sounds like, at all.
No, not at all. Like I said, I don't miss the phone calls. Matter of fact, I told the mayor when I had advised her I was going to be leaving. I told her, I said, one of the first things I told her was, now when you call, your calls will go to voicemail. I'm not going to answer the phone.
I'm sure she understood that too.
she did. We had a good laugh off of it, but yeah.
One of the things you mentioned there too, and it sort of ties in with this a little bit, is, as you said, you've been in law enforcement, started back in the late 80s, and I started in mid 80s for prosecution. And I suspect when you started, and I know when I started, the answer at that time was, okay, you commit a crime, go to jail.
Right.
And in fact, we would both, I'm sure both of us, if someone came back a second or third time, okay, you need more jail.
Yes.
Put them in for a longer time period. They said they didn't learn the lesson the first time. Let's put them back, and maybe they'll learn this time.
Yeah.
Obviously, and I think both of us will agree, there are some people who scare us, and they need to go away.
Yes.
But there's a lot of people that are not in that situation.
Right.
And it's just, I know part of your career has been looking at that aspect of broadening and trying to find other avenues
Yes.
for responses and for changing behavior. We obviously, as we said, we worked both at that time NADCP, now All Rise, and you founded, I think, the Community Justice Forum, or what is that? And how? But in terms of this overall, how have you looked at this whole aspect of the evolution that you're in now? From okay, that I understand completely. Put him in jail right at the beginning, and now it's like that's not always the answer.
Yeah. We there's something we used to say back when you and I were both in DC, is that there are people we're afraid of and people we're mad at.
Yep.
And the ones we were afraid of, it was clear. I mean, you know, someone who had really violent tendencies could commit murder, and you couldn't be sure about their ability to maintain control enough to be in society. And the people we were mad at, and those are the ones that had addiction issues, and that a lot of the crime they committed was to support that. And so for me, what I liked about that is it drew a clear line between those we were trying to help to get to a point where they could again be productive members of the community, and those that we would not jeopardize the community's safety.
Sure.
Letting them out and around innocent victims. So what we had to look at, and what I've always looked at, is how do we deal with the one side, and then, but also make it clear to people that we understood there was another side that we had to try to address. And so one of the things I looked at was that if you tell the community what's going on and why you're taking a position you're taking, often, people will understand, but you have to take the time to explain. And that's something, a terminology that we used in policing when I was coming up through the ranks. It's take the time to explain. You are the Rochester Police Department. So it was to remind us that when we go out there, don't assume that community members understood exactly what was going on or why we did the things we did, but take the time to explain to them. And I always tried to do that. And I'll tell you something interesting is I found once I got into the management level and got promoted, often as a supervisor, if I got a complaint, I was explaining. But the officer didn't necessarily take the time to do. And so I always tried to keep those things in mind, and I still practice that wherever I go.
Sounds like the transparency you were talking about.
Yes.
That it was needed up there. It needs to be there everywhere anyways.
It does. It really, if you want less pushback and obstruction, then you have to respect people enough, show them that respect, and explain, what's going on. And I will tell you that one of the things that was really difficult, and we talk about addiction, crime, but one of the things I also saw, especially for that year, is we had a record number of officer-involved shootings where someone was shot, and I believe in almost every case, I think around of the number, I think only one resulted in the person not dying. But the other interesting part here is that all of those people they had a couple of things in common. They had behavioral health issues.
Okay.
and they were unstably housed. And one of the other things I learned, and as I, worked at NDCI, or All Rise now, is that, excuse me, is that when you look at things like addiction and how it impacts the community, you have to take a moment to also understand the perceptions of crime and how they impact the community, because sometimes the statistical data may not necessarily reflect information and belief, but people feel that way, based on what their experiences, their trauma, and you have to respect that and deal with it, or you're going to get obstacles, because they're not experts necessarily in what you've been dealing with or what you see as a professional out on the street and as you deal with the crime issues, but they know how they feel.
Yep.
And you have to be able to deal with that. And that's something I really worked hard to try to do as police chief, to not just deal with the what I knew were the realities, but also to deal with people's feelings and perceptions, because it was important.
And sometimes perception is reality.
It really is. It really is. The fear is there.
Yeah.
The hurt, the anger.
Yeah.
You got to deal with it.
So you've had quite the span there for your career. Challenges and exciting things going on, and learning things as you went along all the time. One of the things you've mentioned here and sort of referenced, let me come back to it a little bit, is addiction or substance use dependency. Fair to say, from your experience and from everything that you've learned over this time, that's an issue for driving criminal activity?
It really is. Matter of fact, unless things have changed, I haven't seen the most recent statistics, but if you're addicted to opiates, or you're involved in drug use, then your likelihood of committing criminal conduct is at least 50% higher than others who are out there committing crimes for different reasons. And we know it's to facilitate a drug habit. I mean, we know this, and it always struck me that that the 2 and 2, go hand in hand. So It's not if, it's when and how, and that's how we have to look at that. And it really, from a personal level standpoint, is I always looked at those situations, especially as a law enforcement person, and as a police chief, that if that were my family, my friends, I would want them to be able to go about their lives without too much fear and obstacles in dealing with crime. I wouldn't want that. So I would want, my best efforts would be to see that community peoples who are in the same position.
Yeah.
If that were my mom.
Absolutely.
I just would want better for them. And so when you look at addiction, and I will tell you this, we're not going to arrest our way out of this situation. It's just not going to happen. And it's not fair to community members if we don't help them to understand that that's not, there's the perception, but here are the facts. And if we want to get to a point where we're dealing with this situation so that we can, the quality of our quality of life in our communities is much better as a result, arresting and hiring more law enforcement is not going to get us there. Because if it did, I would have done it.
Yeah. Well, and how many times, and again, we're both talking from experience in some respects in this sense, but how many, I'll say, domestic violence cases did you have where alcohol was a factor or some other drug was a factor? I mean,
Right.
And then when they get sober, they either can't believe what they did, but they're basically, I mean, obviously, but again, there's some people, no, it didn't matter. That wasn't the issue, but many times you've seen it in your job. I've seen it in mine.
We have.
And so let me come back then to what you mentioned here as far as one of the things you were talking about there is we can't arrest our way out of this problem.
Right.
And but we need to do something, obviously. There has to be a response. And obviously, to some extent, we saw that a response with treatment courts.
Yes.
But that's obviously for those individuals that are truly dependent on that substance, whatever that is.
Right. Right.
And the high risk, high need is the phrase that's used. But how do we deal with these individuals? And you and I know, and some people forget, change is hard.
It is. We've all been there.
Yeah. But asking someone to stop using a substance that they may be dependent on or that they've relied on for so long.
Exactly.
How do we move forward there? How do we help process this and really have that evolution of recognizing, okay, jail's appropriate at times or incarceration at times, but what are we going to do?
Well, one of the things I've found really enlightening is as I would go through the drug court process. I mean, you know it, you see what the best practices are, but when you go into a drug court, you sit through it and you're watching a good drug court judge go through the process, understand that they're going to fall a few times before they get it right. But knowing when to enact that strategy, whether it's having them having them sit through court instead of letting them go right away, or putting them in jail for a night. I will never forget what this one judge had said to defendant. He was in the program, and when the judge had told him that, you're going to be held overnight, and I remember he said, the participant, he said, so I'm going to jail just because I used. As he was walking away, he said that. The deputies were leading him away, and the judge said, whoa, wait a minute. And he had the deputies bring him back, all the way back up right in front of him. And he said, he had the guy repeat it. He said, you're sending me to jail because I used. I'm an addict. And the judge said, no, you're going to jail because you lied to me. That's why you're going to jail overnight, he said. So I just want to be clear about that. You're in drug court. It's expected that sometimes you're going to relapse. We understand that. But we also made it clear to you that your way out of this process is not to lie and deceive. He said, so you're going in for lying and that's it. I just want to be clear about that. And then he let him go. Never forgot that.
Yeah. And that, it's an important
Talk about changing behavior.
Yeah. It's an important lesson, as you said it, and in fact, even you to watch it and see it happen and see there. And I says, hopefully that participant heard it and learned and moved on from there. As we both know, that's always the challenge, but many of them do understand that and do learn it.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've been to a number of graduation ceremonies, which are very joyous occasions, and
they really are.
Seeing the success of change of behavior.
They really are. Yeah. And if for somebody like me and you too, who's watched their struggle from the beginning, to understand the magnitude of what they were able to accomplish. But we also know that another court I visited and I don't have the term exactly right, but I remember the court staff saying that we have returned another fully functioning, tax-paying member of society back
Okay.
to the fold.
Yeah.
It doesn't get any better. A productive member of society, contributing to the bottom line, not taking from it. I loved the saying. It was really good. Yeah.
So, as a law enforcement officer, I know right now you're not, but I suspect I would say you are law enforcement. That's who you are.
that never goes away. I call it being a cop in recovery.
Well,
it just doesn't go away.
And same thing. Obviously, mine's a career of prosecution. I always consider myself a prosecutor, even when I was in D.C. I'm a prosecutor, even though I'm not in the courtroom.
Yeah.
But
so you understand.
Obviously, the group that we are familiar working with, that's not their first reaction of recognizing the dependency and having that as a cause of a crime. How do we get the people out there, and it's not just law enforcement, just not for prosecutors, it's many in the community as well, because that's how we have grown as a society in many respects. How do we get that message out there? How do we change the understanding?
Well, I think there are two ways to look at it, and I'll tell you quickly up front. One is that everybody has somewhere in their family that this is an issue they've had to deal with.
Yeah.
The other is making it clear, educating law enforcement that we have to take a different approach in order to really have an impact here. And not just educate law enforcement, but also have municipal governments demand that of them. That you want to educate because you want law enforcement on board. People participate better when they understand the mission, when you take the time to explain, as I've mentioned. But it's a little more than that. When you talk about your goals, one of the things I noted as police chief, you really are able to have an impact by your ability to implement policy and rules, because some people you're going to be able to convince, somewhere on the fence, and we're going to come along anyway. Others are very willing to look at a different way. But you're always going to have a group that's kind of maybe a bit of a holdout. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to convince you, but here's the policy. I expect you to follow it.
Yeah.
But that tends to be your smaller group.
Well, it's sort of the final point I'll make a point here is that, again, you had seen these cases, and I have too, where it's the 6th or 7th time we're seeing Bob show back up again.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, what are you doing? Why are you back here? And as you've said, jail hasn't changed their behavior.
Right.
So, well, Cynthia, I want to thank you for the discussion about this. I think it's an important discussion that we continue over time here and share, as you said, the transparency and sharing the message out there. I think this has been a fantastic discussion, and I'm even more excited that you are the new vice president for law enforcement with JSI. That's fantastic.
I'm excited about that. I really am. There's so much we can do.
And we're looking forward to that aspect. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But again, thank you so much for everything you've done in your career. And thank you so much for where you're going and working with JSI now, even more so, to help us move forward and really help change happen.
All right. Well, let's get started.